Chapter 6 of The Mystery of a Turkish Bath. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Darvinia. The Mystery of a Turkish Bath by Rita. Chapter 6. Enchantment. When a proud woman yields to the entreaties of a lover, she yields with a grander humility, a more complete self-surrender, than one to whom coquetry and conquests are natural attributes of vanity. The Princess Zairoff, to whom men's admiration was as familiar as the air of heaven, who possessed rank and wealth and loveliness such as dower few women, had yet never granted to one human being a sign of tenderness, or unveiled, so to speak, the deep strange depths of her strange nature to any beseechment. But now, for one brief hour, she threw back the portals of emotion. She was a woman, pure and simple. The man beside her was the one man in the world to whom her memory had been faithful. Boy and girl, they had known each other in years long past. As boy and girl, they had shared in the same tastes, and been penetrated with the same desires for the mystic and the unknown. Living in a remote part of India, under very careless guardianship, and with no one to care for their pursuits or remark them, they had made the acquaintance of a learned and somewhat mysterious native, and from his lips they first heard some hints of the wonders that nature reveals to the earnest student. As time went on, they were separated. The boy was sent to England, the girl remained in the East. When they met again, he was a young lieutenant in an infantry regiment, stationed at one of the most popular stations of a popular presidency, and she was the reigning queen of the same station. Again fate parted them. 2 years went by. Their next meeting was in Egypt, where she was travelling with her guardian. Julian Estcourt had learned his heart's secret by then, but there was a coldness, a strangeness, about the girl who had been his boyhood's friend, that kept him back from anything bearing the imputation of love-making. Much as they were together, long and frequent as were their talks, those talks were yet curiously impersonal for their age and sex, and however much the young man's heart might throb with its hidden passion, there yet lay between them a barrier, a restraint, light yet strangely strong, and his lips never dared betray the secret of his long-cherished devotion. Another separation, another meeting. Time had worked changes in both. She was a beautiful woman, proud, cold, queenly. He had acquired strength of character, loftier ideals, and a sense of the value of intellectual gifts, which had kept him singularly free from, and indifferent to, the temptations of the senses. He had learnt to drink mental stimulants with avidity. He had made 1 or 2 brilliant successes in literature, and was looked upon as a supremely odd fish by his brother officers. That third meeting decided his fate. He spoke out his love, spurred on by a rivalry he had good cause to dread, but spoke to no purpose. Calmly, though with a sorrow she did not attempt to disguise, she told her old playmate and friend that her choice was made. She was going to marry the old, vicious, and fabulously wealthy Russian prince, Fedor Ivanovitch Zairoff. She made no pretence of caring for the man whom, out of a host of suitors, she had selected to wed. When her young lover stormed and upbraided her, she only raised those wonderful stag-like eyes to his face and said, "I have a reason, Julian. I cannot explain it. I dare not say more. Believe me, I could not make you happy. It would not be permitted." And having long ago learnt that arguments were utterly useless before that formula, he had to stand aside, to crush back a strong and unconquerable passion, to see her pass from his sight and knowledge, and to bear his life as best he could, with that feeling in his heart of having staked all on one throw, and lost, that makes so many men desperate and vicious. That it did not make Julian Estcourt so was entirely due to great strength of moral character, and a belief in the responsibilities with which life is charged, and for the abuse of which it is destined to suffer in future states or conditions, as well as in its present. If such belief were universally accepted and pursued, we should soon cease to hear those ridiculous and humiliating phrases with which popular favourites are extenuated for the reckless and disgraceful waste of mind, energy, and usefulness, occasioned by some trifling disappointment or misfortune. There would be no more sins glossed over as sowing wild oats, and having his fling, or driven to the bad, because once an individual feels he is responsible to himself for undue physical indulgences, for laws of natural life set at naught, and spiritual impulses disregarded, he will try to emerge from the slough of evil, and he will learn with startling rapidity to value all joys of the senses less and less. There can be no high order of morality without this sense of responsibility, for when a man feels he is moulding his own character, forming, as it were, fresh links in the chain of endurance, adding by every act and thought and word to that personality he is bound to confront as himself, to re-inhabit as himself, and to judge as himself, then life rises into an importance that words cannot convey, but which the soul alone recognizes and feels, in those better moments that are mercifully granted to each and all of us. So Julian Estcourt took up his burden, saddened, aged, embittered perhaps, but not one whit more inclined to squander the gifts of life or the fruits of discipline than he had been in his dreamy, studious youth. He neither sought distraction in evil and dissipated courses, nor death by any of those foolhardy and rash exploits which have far too often been glorified as courage or pluck. He was graver, more reticent, more studious than of yore, and he found his reward, though few even of his intimate associates were aware of his abnormal gifts or his superior knowledge. Such was the man who, still in the prime of life's best years, still with thirst unslaked for that one divine draught of love, which, once at least, is offered to mortal lips, stood now in the soft December moonlight by the side of the woman he had worshipped for long in secret and in pain, and cried aloud in triumph to his heart, "At last happiness is mine." His whole consciousness was pervaded with a sense of ecstasy that seemed to make all past pain and regret sink into utter insignificance. To stand there by her side, to drink in that wonderful beauty of face and form, was a joy that brought absolute forgetfulness of everything outside and apart from its new and magical acquisition. The world was forgotten. Even the possibility of a formal and imperative ceremonial, by which his newly won treasure must be secured to himself at last, barely flashed across his consciousness. He did not trouble himself to put it into words. He listened to the brief, disjointed fragments of her speech, fragments which gave a dim picture of her life in these empty years of division. Now and then he spoke of himself. She listened. Once she turned to him with an impulse of tenderness strange in one so cold and self-possessed. "Ah," she cried softly, "I have made you suffer, but it was not my will. Oh, always believe that. And I will give you compensation. I can promise it. Now." They seemed to him the sweetest words that ever fell from mortal lips, and no less sweet, though infinitely puzzling, was that exquisite humility with which she crowned the wonder of her self-surrender. Yet, even as he heard, his brain grew bewildered, his senses seemed to reel. Strange thoughts and shapes seemed to hover around him, and all the soft dim space of night appeared a black and peopled horror. For a moment he felt that consciousness was forsaking him, that the shock of this unexpected joy was beyond his strength to bear. Dizzy and sick, he swayed suddenly forwards. A cool hand touched his brow, a voice reached his ear. With a mighty effort he shook off the paralyzing weakness, and sank down by the side of his enchantress. "Is it a dream?" he murmured, vaguely. "Shall I wake to-morrow and know you have mocked me again?" "Nay, my beloved," she whispered. "This is no dream. Never again shall I mock you. I am but a woman now who loves. Earth holds no weaker thing." When Julian Estcourt entered the public drawing-room nearly 2 hours after he had left it, several curious eyes turned towards him. The card-players had finished their game and broken up into various groups. A few men were yawning and apparently meditating a retreat to the smoking-room. No one seemed particularly energetic, but the entrance of that tall soldierly figure struck a new note of interest in the languid assemblage. He seemed to bring, as it were, a breeze of vitality, a sense of freshness and energy along with him from the starlit air and the pine-scented woods. His head was erect, his eyes shone with the radiance of happiness. A certain sense of pride, of triumph, and yet of deep, intense content, was in his aspect and his smile. Mrs. Ray Jefferson, her spirits still unimpaired by losses at poker, was the first to remark audibly on the change. "Why, Colonel," she said, "have you been having a Turkish bath? Guess you look as fresh and perky as if you'd taken a new lease of life." He laughed. "The only bath I have taken," he said, "is one of moonlight. You should all be out on the terrace. Far healthier and more enjoyable than these hot gaslit rooms, I assure you." "The terrace!" said Mrs Jefferson, looking at him with a sudden stern accusing glance. "Ladies and gentlemen, what did I tell you? I do believe..." She paused dramatically, every eye turned fully and searchingly upon the handsome face and erect figure, so calmly and easily confronting this sudden criticism. "Well," he said at last, "what is it you believe?" "You've seen her!" burst out Mrs Jefferson eagerly. "Now, Colonel, no tricks. Plain yes or no. I'm certain you've seen her. My mystery. Haven't you?" "I will not pretend," he said, "to misunderstand you. I have met an old friend, and I hope soon to have the pleasure of introducing her to you all. Not with any mystery about her, as our American friend seems determined to suppose, but simply as the Princess Zairoff, of whom you may have heard before this." There was a buzz, a stir, a confused murmur. "Heard of her? I should think so. You never mean to say she's here? I thought she was in Russia." "Gracious!" almost shrieked Mrs Jefferson. "Why, it was her husband who died so mysteriously, on the eve of that awful conspiracy. You never mean to say, Colonel Estcourt, that you know her? Why, she's one of the celebrities of Europe, and to come here, to this quiet place, and incognito." "Do you not think," he said, "that the fact of being quiet and unknown would just be the one fact she would appreciate? I hope I am not claiming too much from your courtesy when I say that the privilege of her society can only be obtained by a due regard to her wishes in that respect. She wishes only to be known as Madame Zairoff here." "I'm sure," exclaimed Mrs Jefferson eagerly, "I'm only too willing to promise anything for the privilege of seeing her. Isn't that the general opinion also?" There was a murmur of assent, specially eager on the part of the men. "I can only assure you," continued Colonel Estcourt gravely, "that you will not regret the slight inconvenience of repressing personal curiosity; for Madame Zairoff is a woman whose gifts and graces are of a marvellous nature, and calculated to delight the most critical society. As Mrs Jefferson told us, she is here for her health. It is an incident we cannot deplore, if we are to benefit by her society." "You'd better all look out for your hearts, gentlemen," laughed Mrs Jefferson gaily and excitedly. "I assure you I don't believe there's another woman in the world like her. I've seen her under trying circumstances, and I give you my word of honour that a woman who can preserve any charm of personal appearance under the ordeal of a Turkish bath—" There came a discreet little cough from the neighbourhood of Mrs Masterman. The little American stopped abruptly. "I'd best say no more," she said. Then she laughed. "All the same, if you could only see us!" Chapter 7